Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves. Welcome, Austin and Jim. F-16 has been approved to go to Ukraine, Jim. What is the effect of that going to be on the war efforts there?
Well, it gives the Ukrainians a much better aircraft than anything the Russians have. You know, while the F-16 kept getting improved, after the Cold War ended, the Russian, aircraft manufacturing industry. One thing the F-16 had, in fact, Western aircraft in general, was an integrated cockpit, or how should I put it, a glass cockpit with a lot easier to use instruments. There was also the helmets, which the Israelis pioneered, which have a built-in head-up display, so the pilot can basically never have to put it, look down to do anything with the controls. It's all right in front of him on the head-up display on the screen in front of him. And the latest version is basically look and shoot. All he has to do is turn around and blink or whatever. I forget exactly what the cue is. But it will launch a heat-seeking missile at where he's looking, and it will, basically go after the target. The American aircraft always had an easier-to-use cockpit. The Russians still have a lot of, switches and, all sorts of nonsense that you're going to be distracted by whenever you're doing anything. The Ukrainians tried to overcome some of this with their Russian aircraft because they were adding American weapons, which technically you're not supposed to be able to do, but they did it. Resourceful, those Ukrainians. But by getting the F-16, they can dispense with all that, and they basically have a much superior aircraft, not only for, air-to-air combat, but also for ground attack, which is what they'll probably use it for more than anything else. It can carry a wide array of weapons. It has a ASA radar, that's a solid-state radar, which has a much longer range and is much better at targeting, locating and identifying a target and, launching a bomb or a missile or what have you. The Russians have nothing like that. They never did, and apparently they never will at the rate they're going. Their Air Force is basically falling apart, and they're suffering losses they can't replace. So, the F-16 is basically going to, help the Ukrainians win their war faster and basically, put what's left of the Russian Air Force in its grave because, like I say, the Russians never had much to begin with, and now that's all disappearing very quickly.
Austin, what do you see as the effects?
Well, let me pick up on a couple of the technical things, the comments that Jim made. One of the things is this is completely unknown by me. What kind of communication suites or connectivity beyond the other Ukrainian planes, other Ukrainian F-16s, Ukrainian ground control and the like, these planes will be equipped with. I know what U.S. and NATO aircraft use. It's possible for a U.S. aircraft, F-16, to be linked up on an operation with a Norwegian F-16 and a Turkish F-16. It's common communications suite. I mean, it can be turned on, turned off, and the like. And that would apply to all strike and reconnaissance aircraft and air control aircraft in NATO, but it's something that is let's call it Western NATO. The Japanese and South Koreans can tap into it as well. Our Jim talked about some of the human aircraft innovations that the F-16 possesses, making it far more survivable and far more deadly. And he says it's going to tear up the whatever is left of the Russian Air Force. I think it will do that, Dan, over Ukrainian territory, because once you get into the Russian ground air defenses and deeper into Russia, if you're going to try to use it for a strike on a Russian strategic bomber base, I would not do that. I think that it'd be lost. Of course, I don't know what the Ukrainians know or NATO allied intelligence knows about penetration routes to some of the strategic bases that are deeper in Russia. And the reason I bring them up, Dan, is that this is something that we've covered in strategy talk, and Jim's certainly written about on strategy page, is that they use their bombers as missile launchers, and they don't even come over Ukrainian territory. It's based on the range of some of the missiles they're using. They may not come within 200, 250 kilometers of the Russian Ukrainian border, and they launch it from enough altitude and then turn around and fly back. That's I'm gonna guess, I could be dead wrong, but I'm gonna guess that that's still gonna be a tough target, even once the Ukrainians get the F-16. Now let's go to some of the quote unquote human factors. I never bought the line coming out of the Pentagon and Washington that we can't give them F-16s. It'll take them too long to train them. In part, I read I read two different versions of this interview with a Ukrainian pilot. He'd been flying MiG-29s when his MiG-29 still worked, and then he'd moved to another aircraft, I forget which, and he'd shot down at least 4 Russian jets in combat. And this is I'm going to say April or May of 2022. I read these articles, and he says he was asked about how long it would take him to transition to an F-16, and he says, "Look, all of these aircraft, they're different." And he says, and I know some of the things about the F-16. He says, "I think I could learn in about a day." And of course, he sounded like the hotshot type that's the really successful jet fighter pilot, air-to-air combat type pilot. But I think that is he's telling substantial truth. He wasn't being just cocky. It might take him a week. No, would he be up to quote unquote NATO standards or being able to fly like the RAF, U.S. Air Force, the Israelis? No, but he'd be good, and he'd be better, as Jim has indicated, than his Russian enemies. But it wasn't that they didn't listen to him, as discounted. He wasn't the only Ukrainian pilot that I read about saying, "Give us F-16s." As a matter of fact, I think either we discussed this after recording a strategy talk, or we did it on a strategy talk. This came up sometime last year, and I made the point that it would be so easy to cascade out of U.S. Air Force Reserve F-16 units and U.S. Air Guard F-16s. You'd be able to provide the Ukrainians with a couple of dozen or 3 dozen F-16s without in any way harming U.S. readiness. And those would be replaced by the new F-16 Viper that we're buying the latest update of the F-16. I don't remember if we did that live or not, but I was just coming up with a way, logistically, politically, and quickly to get out of the U.S. inventory of our reserve forces. They wouldn't be top notch, latest model, latest version of the F-16, but they'd be very, very good. And of course, that didn't happen. And it's been another year or at least 10 months. And now we're finally moving to a point where they're going to acquire the aircraft. But then I just read yesterday that a Pentagon spokesman said it's going to take anywhere from 4 to 6 months before we have the Ukrainians are able to use these aircraft. We're going to have to find them, and the implication in the Pentagon statement was we'll have to find these aircraft. Well, I know where they are, and I know how quickly you could move on it if you gave the command decision to do it. Now, what does it mean? Jim's already said what it means for the remnant Russian Air Force. These are also, if you manage to suppress Russian ground air defenses, I see them as being a real asset in close air support. Selected targets, and it's something that they needed, and it's sad that the Ukrainians, it's taken so long to get them to at least begin the process of getting them F-16s.
So, Jim, are the F-16s going to come from other NATO countries too?
Yes, there are several NATO countries that are basically converting to F-35s, and they have plenty of surplus F-16s, and they're ready to move them into Ukraine. The Ukrainian pilots are very familiar with the F-16. I mean, there are ways you can study them without actually being in one. And apparently the Ukrainians have been provided with simulators and various other, learning devices. So basically, it won't take them, as Austin, I think, pointed out, take a few days or at most a week before they're pretty proficient. The F-16 also has excellent excellent digital communications. They can basically transfer information from one to another, or as Austin pointed out, to other NATO F-16s. In Ukraine, the Ukrainians would basically be operating on their own, not with any NATO forces. But the Ukrainians are eager and able to make a quick use of any F-16s we can send them. And like I say, there are our European allies who are already waiting. They have F-16s available, and they can have them in there, in a few days or a week or whatever, and put them to work. And I think that's come as a shock to many people, because the American Air Force has always been, poo-poo, it'll take them so long to learn it and blah, blah, blah. They underestimate, the fact that the Ukrainians have again and again shown that they're very quick to learn how to use new weapons. They've done that time and again, and the F-16s won't be any different.
Austin, are there other weapon systems that should be sent to Ukraine at this point, or do they have everything that they need?
Well, they definitely don't have everything they need. Let me put it this way. It depends on the way you ask, emphasis of that question. The Ukrainians have in trump cards the guts of what they need, which is determination, national will, technical expertise. That's what Jim was talking about, that how quickly they learn how to use things, or because there's also porosity of information. If you want to find out about new artillery systems or new propellants, new types of ammunition, they just go on the internet or troll through subscription services like Aerospace Defense Daily or Jane's or the like, and you can get if you're savvy to weapons and military technology, you can learn a lot just from the advertisements. But they've got that down, and that's what's often called the intangibles, or When Jim talks about human factors or writes about that and how to make war, they've got that. What do they need? Well, remember Zelensky's wisecrack after the Biden administration said they told him to get out. He says, I don't need transportation. I need ammunition or something to that effect. They need ammo, and they've been getting a lot of ammo from all kinds of sources, not just NATO, but also European neutrals. Even the Swiss have supplied them with military-related equipment. I'm not sure about artillery ammunition. I know through various trade-off deals, South Korea has provided them with artillery ammunition, replacing U.S. stocks, I think is the way it was done diplomatically and politically. And Japan quite recently came out and said something that everybody had kind of known Japan's been doing for about a year, which is providing Ukraine with advice and material aid. So they need ammo. They need artillery ammo. We talked about that in a recent strategy talk about the ammunition consumption rates. I think they need longer range missiles. The British have upped the ante with their Storm Shadow, but I think Ukraine needs weapons, yes, that can hit Russian supply and logistic centers and headquarters. Are they on the Russian side of the border? They're supporting operations inside Ukraine. I realize that ups the a risk of quote unquote a spreading war, but if you're going to be decisive on this, the Ukrainians need to be able to stop hit key Russian supply and headquarters nodes. And better to do it, I think, with artillery or missiles than risk aircraft. Aircraft intrusion would be a real diplomatic pucker factor. They need those. Now, if you want to start talking about tanks, that's so slow with that. We talked about this sometime this spring about Leopard 2s and advanced M1 Abrams and the like. Again, how long it takes to bring crews up to snuff. It doesn't really take that long when you've got experienced tankers, which the Ukrainians do. But which one was the best for them? I think Jim and I had a little disagreement about this. I'm an Abrams guy to the max, but you're running it on aviation fuel, essentially, and the Leopard runs on diesel, and that's what the Ukrainians, it's far easier to apply. And I think the Leopard 2 is the tank they need. I think a lot of the Ukrainians think the Leopard 2 is the tank you need. I'm not saying the Leopard 2 is better than the advanced Abrams. I don't think it is. And I don't think it's better than the advanced British tanks. The Challenger, I think. But and the Leclerc is a good tank. The French equivalent of these modern main battle tanks. But the Leopard makes sense for them. And I don't think you get by with 80 Leopards. What is a decisive figure? Well, I actually sat down and gamed this out last year, and I think they need at least 250. 250, and of course, backed up by the appropriate mix of mechanized infantry. But it's just not counting tanks. It's got to be combined arms warfare, which I know we've talked about, and heck, I've written about that. The Ukrainians have shown that they understand how to do the deadly ballet, as it's called. I mean, you've got your tanks mixed with mechanized infantry and local air defense cover, hopefully. You've got, to get back to F-16s, you've got close air support and at least air parity, if not air superiority over your mechanized forces. That's the way the U.S. likes to fight. That's the way anybody who wins needs to fight. You need to have the better than air parity, because the armored vehicles are vulnerable to long range fire and air attack. But I came up with that roughly 250, and it was Leopard 2s in the mix. In other words, basically what you'd have if you had a full up plus armor division, and that I think is a breakthrough force. It's going to have engineer support as well. That's something I don't know a lot about in the Ukrainian inventory, but mobile bridges, armor vehicle launch bridges, AVLBs as they're called in the U.S. Army. That's that. If you're going to fight and you have to cross major rivers, you need those, and you need to be able to protect them and protect them by from air attack, and be able to fire counter battery at enemy artillery units. They'll be shooting at those bridges because they're choke points, but you need them in order to get across, so you can conduct a mobile attack. So again, I think they're getting some of the weapons. I guess is the way we should have put it. They're getting some of the types of weapons they need. I don't know that they have enough, Dan.
Well, they've already received about 100 Leopard 1s, the older Leopard, which many European countries kept in reserve just in case. And the Ukrainian situation came along and said, well, this is what we kept them for. And these are already being used. Now, these are not as heavily armored as the Leopard 2. They're basically a 1960s design. But they're adequate enough. And they've got about 100 of them in there already, providing support, artillery support for attacks, for, as you also put it, combined arms attacks. You can have dozens of these Leopard 1s with their 105 millimeter, cannon, delivering firepower to the infantry up front. And that's more than anything the Russians can deal with. I mean, the most modern Russian tanks, yes, are superior to the Leopard 1, but the Russians haven't got many modern tanks in Ukraine. And the Leopard 1 to them is, just as horrifying and a threat as Leopard 2s. So, the Ukrainians are taking anything they can get and putting it right to work. So they're not really waiting for the Abrams. By the way, the Abrams is a multi-fuel engine, so they can basically, burn anything. That's something that, often gets lost because we usually can give them just one type of jet fuel and standardize on that. But the tank was designed to basically, burn anything. And it's turned out to be, still quite successful with that. So the Ukrainians, knew that. They're ready to try it. They have plenty of anything that burns, to put into the Abrams to keep them going. And as we've already seen, they've taken these Leopard 1s and put them right to work. So the Russians are already in a world of hurt because the Ukrainians are basically taking any Western tanks they can get and demonstrating that they're superior to anything the Russians can put in their way. So I think the Russians are in for big trouble. They won't have to wait, several months for the for United States or NATO to get them the latest stuff. They've already got the good enough stuff, and it's doing the job.
Let me make a comment about Leopard 1. I got to climb on one in 1975 when I was in the 11th Cat. It was a military unit. I think it was 12th Panzer that was headquartered in Würzburg. And I also saw one of them moving. It just looked like it was fast as lightning, low, and it got a 105 on it. The criticism I got, and as I recall, it was a Canadian officer, maybe a year later, talking about Leopards. I think it was 76 or something like that. That he didn't put it this way, but he says they're too lightly armored. And you'll see occasional criticism in the defense press, like of the Leopard 1, calling it a tank destroyer-like tank because, as Jim mentioned, the lighter armor. It's vulnerable to overhead attack. There's no question about that. And it doesn't have the anywhere near the modern armor, the Chalum type armor that the Abrams and Leopard 2 and other advanced NATO tanks have. But adequate, yeah, especially if you got a trained tank crew that knows how to use it. And Jim, you're right on this about the likely Russian armored vehicles they'd come up against. They what do they call it? APFSDS, armor piercing, fin stabilized, discarding Sabo 105 round, has a good penetration characteristics at 1,200 meters. Now, I fired a couple of them. I'm talking about service Sabo, not just the target practice version. And they got a lot of kick, and they got a lot of penetrating power. So, Jim, your point is well taken about the Leopard 1.
Yeah, the one thing I'm worried about with all those Leopard 1s they're sending in, did they have enough ammunition? Well, apparently so far they do, because the tank hasn't been in active service for years. But like I said, they didn't throw the ammunition away, or they were able to fabricate new ammunition. And the Ukrainians are doing quite a job, with these so-called obsolete tanks. The Russians have few effective anti-tank weapons against any tank. So the Ukrainians are basically moving into a low-threat environment with these the Leopard 1s and any other tanks they can get. And I think that's what worries the Russians the most. They're very short. I mean, they basically just lost almost all their modern tanks in the first few months of the war, and they haven't been able to replace them. I mean, their tank replacement capability is quite low, and they're complaining about that in Russia, that it's going to take them years to basically replace all they lost in the first few months in Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of Russians are calling for, let's just stop this. Get out, because otherwise we're going to be involved in a war that we can't win, and we're going to just keep taking a lot of losses. Now, Putin doesn't go along with that, but his situation is getting shakier and shakier. And that's another story. That's more, political than military. But, the Russians are getting tired of being sent into a meat grinder in Ukraine. Ukrainians, as Austin pointed out, are willing to fight. It's their country. They're not a lost province of Russia or whatever. And, that alone is was enough to give the Russians headaches. In fact, in the initial invasion, the Ukrainians had very few modern weapons, but the ones they had, they put right to use, and they chewed up the Russians big time. Now they've gotten, more modern weapons, more weapons in general, tanks, anti-tank weapons, and what have you, artillery. The Russians haven't been able to replace their losses, and that's adding up. It's a question of how long it's going to take the Ukrainians to take back everything. I mean, the Russians are now worried about losing, Crimea. Crimea, they always thought, well, you can only get into it through a narrow, isthmus, which is basically a lot of, marshes and what have you. But now they're worried about the Ukrainians basically with their superior aircraft and air-to-surface missiles and what have you. The Ukrainians are already starting to chew up Russian forces in Crimea, so they may be able to just walk in and take the place, because there aren't going to be many Russian forces left intact or in fighting condition the way things are going.
Well, that's a good place to end.
Yeah, it is.
Good discussion, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Okay, take care.
Bye.